Hello, this is Sue Lloyd, Vice Chair of the ISSB, and I'm joined by our Chair, Emmanuel Faber, recording this podcast following our first board week meeting in 2023 here in our Frankfurt office. So this was a really busy week for us. We started with a big board meeting for the first month of the year with 10 papers, advancing our redeliberations on our first two standards. And a lot of what we're looking at this week was guidance to help companies to really make a proportional and scalable approach to applying the standards, especially when they first start out. But before we get into the board decisions this week, maybe Emmanuel, perhaps we start out by looking sort of big picture, some of the priorities and milestones that we're working towards at the moment.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'll go. Thank you, Sue. And indeed, that was a great week this week in Frankfurt. Happy New Year to all of you who are listening to us. And exciting year ahead. And I know a lot of stakeholders are keen to know when the standards will be issued. And I'm pleased to report that we're progressing well with the development of S1 and S2. And we are on track to publish towards the end of Q2 this year. We hope to finalize our redeliberations of the feedback we received next month in Montreal before moving to the formal balloting of the standards. And we'll share more insights into what that process involves in next month's podcast, so stay tuned. We are also prioritizing work to strengthen and enhance the use of the standards, and that includes a number of topics that we've already alluded to, working with partners globally to facilitate capacity building for the adoption of the standards by markets and their application by companies. We will also consult on a proposed digital taxonomy to enable digital reporting of sustainability disclosures from day one. We have started our work on the internationalization of the ISSB standards, which companies applying S1 must consider. We are building connectivity with the IASB, and I'm sure Sue will elaborate more on this about our work this week, to ensure the standards are compatible and avoid inconsistencies. And we are facilitating interoperability with jurisdictional initiatives and GRI standards to deliver the building block approach of our global baseline. And finally, and I think very importantly, we are starting to connect climate and nature and are starting research incremental enhancements to the climate standards around just transition, nature and water and ecosystems, natural ecosystems, to bring essentially more pixels to the use of our climate standards for companies and jurisdictions as soon as practicable, basically. Another big part of the agenda this year, and the first half of this year actually, will be preparing our agenda consultation. We will consult our next priorities, focusing on 4 projects: biodiversity, human capital, human rights, and connectivity, and the latter being a project to work with our sister board, the IASB, to build on management commentary and the integrated reporting framework. These are all projects where we've had feedback from investors and other market participants as important, and I think it's important indeed that we deliver on those. And so an exciting year ahead, but back to this week, Sue. Do you want to share some of the highlights?
Sure. So firstly, a really busy agenda, as I said, 10 papers with some really good analysis and redeliberations based on the, all the wonderful comments we got in the 1,400 comment letters that we received, and probably a good moment to have a shout out for our staff who worked very early in the new year in order to enable us to have such a big agenda in January, so early in January. So thank you to you if you're listening. So what do we talk about? So going through day one, first of all, we had a paper on some of the disclosures in S2. In particular, we were looking at an issue that we had started discussing earlier on, which is when we asked for companies to provide information about comparisons to their climate targets and the latest international agreement, what did we mean? And so we put some more clarity on the fact that we wanted to understand how the latest international agreement, Paris at the moment, had informed their climate-related targets, And also, importantly, in that discussion, we did explain how that could mean that a company would provide information about how nationally determined contributions had informed their considerations. So that was a good, important discussion. The next thing we talked about was very much a clarification about the requirement or the objective in S1 and S2 about providing information about metrics. And what we were doing here was adding clarity. And we have a bit of a difference between the metrics objective and other parts of the standard. If you look, say, at governance, we ask a company just to explain what their governance processes actually are. But when we get to metrics and targets, we are asking for particular disclosures. And that's not limited by what a company is actually using when they manage their business. Those disclosures are required when they're material to a company's investors. So there's an important distinction that we wanted to make there. Moving on, we had a discussion on disclosures about the important judgments, assumptions and estimates that a company has made when it puts together its sustainability reporting, and confirmed a package of disclosures around that to really help inform investors and assurers and others about the basis of preparation for the sustainability reporting. And in that, we agreed that the standard should include some guidance which sets out the complete sort of list, if you like, of the types of disclosures that would be anticipated, and that would look at a future date for some sort of more real examples of what the particular disclosures might look like for different fact patterns. Moving on to another important conversation, and this one I found particularly satisfying as a former Vice Chair of the International Accounting Standards Board, because this really shows the power of having a sister body, because we took the opportunity to look across to the IFRS accounting standards for some concepts that we could use repurposed in their new context. And a really important one that we discussed this week was the use of the notion of companies using reasonable and supportable information that's available without undue cost and effort at the reporting date to inform their disclosures that they'll be required to provide. And it's a good paper to look at for those of you who are really interested in the detail, because the staff, I think, had a very thoughtful approach of finding particular circumstances where there's a high level of measurement certainty and identifying particular places where that concept should be used. So, for example, in identifying what's in your value chain or in some measurement circumstances using that concept. So a really great way, I think, of aligning our work and that of the IFRS Accounting Standards Board. And then we had an important discussion on something that came up in quite a few comment letters, a concern that some raised about whether or not, through being required to provide information about their sustainability related risks and opportunities, they may need to give away things that gave them a competitive advantage. Now, this is a really tricky area for standard setters. We're all about transparency. We're all about making sure that investors have all of the material information they need to inform their decision making. So asking us to particularly, exclude that information in some circumstances is a big decision for the board to make. So it was a very careful discussion, and I think a very carefully crafted paper by the staff. But where we landed on was that there would be circumstances where, in providing information about sustainability related opportunities, where that information wasn't already publicly available and where there could be a real significant risk of commercial damage, if you like, to a company in providing that information, that we would allow some relief from disclosure. So very particular wording. Again, if you're interested in that, look at the exact wording, but really trying to get that balance right between appropriate relief for companies, but not creating disadvantages for investors in terms of limiting the information they have available for their decision making. So I think a really good paper from the staff and a really interesting discussion with the board, which I certainly think landed us in a good place. Emmanuel, do you want to talk about day 3?
Thank you, Sue. Day 3 was really today and predominantly about our climate standards. We started from a basis of a cleaning exercise because there are some reliefs that we've already agreed for the Scope 3 emissions related to data from the value chain, where there is a difference in the reporting period with companies in the value chain. So we extended that notion to also Scope 1 and 2 emissions to make it consistent overall. We next went into what I think is one of my favorite discussions, which is climate scenario analysis. And I think we really had a very solid paper prepared by the staff to allow us to discuss the criteria a company would apply to determine the approach to scenario analysis to assess climate resilience, as we look to help companies scale their approach and advance gradually to more sophisticated approaches over time, given different ranges of skills, capabilities, and resources. I think we very usefully referenced the TCFD guidance on using scenario analysis, among others, and landed into a place where I think we are really supporting companies in the preparation of an appropriate and I'd say commensurate to their circumstances, as the paper highlights, that journey of using scenario analysis to create their resilience assessment. And finally, and probably very importantly, we redeliberated on current and anticipated financial effects around sustainability topics, not only climate. That is driving the connectivity, and that's really about creating a holistic package of information for investors, and one that is consistent between financial statements and sustainability disclosure. So we discussed disclosure around how sustainability-related risks or opportunities have affected or are expected to affect financial statements, and the quantitative and qualitative information that should complement each other in a manner that would describe these effects, and when a company can stick to qualitative information if it explains why quantitative information cannot be shared. So I think that sums up our key discussions for this week meeting, and as we are moving to from standard setting most of last year basically to now for S1 and S2 the rollout and the adoptions, I know many questions are raised about what that really means. Would you share a bit of your insight into this, please?
Sure. So it all starts with our objective, of course, and our objective is to deliver this global baseline of sustainability disclosures to meet the needs of the capital markets. And that means delivering a common language that can be used around the world to provide comparable information for investors that's high quality and that gets the balance right between meeting investors' needs, but in a way that's targeted and efficient for companies as well. And so it really starts with having good standards to support that disclosure, and so that's what we've been working hard on, but that of course is not enough, so what else are we doing? So firstly, we're working really hard with the international securities regulators, with IOSCO. That's a conversation that started way back with the Technical Readiness Working Group, but it's ongoing. And our objective there is to have IOSCO endorse S1 and S2, really saying, yes, these are fit for purpose and good for global capital markets. And that doesn't mean that, then jurisdictions immediately use those standards, but that comfort that comes from that IOSCO endorsement is really a way of giving confidence and is a great catalyst for the assistance of securities regulators around the world in the adoption and then the application of those standards around the world. So that endorsement discussion is really an important one. What else are we doing? We're talking with jurisdictions. So the jurisdictional engagement that we do is critically important because the parties that we're talking with there, in particular securities regulators and others, are helping us build a global baseline, and then they're very much involved in adoption conversations in their home jurisdictions or interoperability conversations. And the heart of what we're doing there is with our jurisdictional working group that we've talked about in these podcasts before, that's comprised of the UK, the US, Japan, China, Europe, and us and IOSCO. And now we have announced the membership of our Sustainability Standards Advisory Forum, which is an even larger group of parties from around the world. And that's just to make sure we have, information and a good relationship with those parties, as well as bilateral discussions with many of those partners. The other thing we're seeing around the world is the establishment of new boards focused on sustainability reporting, sort of doing what the IFRS Foundation has done, but at a national level. So we know that Brazil, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, are all putting in place boards and governance arrangements that are really designed to cooperate with the work of the ISSB in a way that's similar to what people familiar with the accounting standards will have seen with national standard setters from around the world. So it's setting up the framework for adoption and ongoing conversations around the world on sustainability reporting in partnership with us. Now, we know that many jurisdictions will require companies to adopt our standards, and that's fantastic, but we're also really interested in voluntary application of our standards. So the fact that investors and companies want our standards to be used around the world is really important to us too. So market engagement that really facilitates the choice to use, the free choice to use the ISSB standards around the world is really important, and we are busy establishing our market engagement strategy and working really closely with investors to get the support for our standards. And I guess the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle is that we know that in some jurisdictions there will be specific jurisdictional requirements. Everybody knows about the work that's going on in Europe, but not only Europe, the US is also talking about their climate rules. And so we are working closely with jurisdictions very much to focus on how we ensure interoperability with jurisdictional initiatives. Again, we're interested in the efficiency for companies and the clarity of information for investors. And the more that there's a clear linkage and relationship and as much consistency as possible between what we require and what jurisdictions require, the more cost effective the reporting can be for companies and the better the clarity of information for investors. So we're working hard on interoperability as well. So in short, Emmanuel, we're busy.
Yeah, I bet we are, and I couldn't agree more with what you just said about the importance of voluntary adoption. I think that is these two change theories basically will nourish each other, because voluntary adoption will of course lower the cost for regulators to go into mandatory adoption, and of course mandatory adoption is obviously creating a level playing field and will probably drive further voluntary adoptions in other jurisdictions. So that is a totally new space in which we are entering as a standard setter. This dual approach of voluntary and mandatory adoption has never been tried before, and we're happy to do this at the global level with all the parties that you've indeed been mentioning, with whom cooperation is absolutely fundamental. I mean, it's a collective effort for the public interest of capital markets good functioning here. So yeah, busy and important first half of the year. That is all from us from Frankfurt. Thank you. See you next month. We will be in Montreal, where we expect to finalize our deliberation on the standards. And we will also be hosting the IFRS Sustainability Symposium on Friday, February the 17th. And we are very excited to hopefully see a number of you there with I think probably a brilliant way for our stakeholders to get up to date with our latest development. So hope to see you there. Thank you.
For the latest developments from either the International Sustainability Standards Board or the International Accounting Standards Board, make sure to subscribe on the IFRS Foundation website, www.ifrs.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please take some time to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast player.